She had a letter with 4 sentences in a train ticket to the edge of the known world. The letter promised one man. What waited for her on that frozen platform was 3 and a 6-year-old girl who ran through the snow, seized her hand, and announced that she was home. Clara Whitfield had no idea what she was walking into. This is the story of what she stayed for. She stepped off the train and into the coldest air she had ever breathed. December in Montana Territory was not the December she had known in Philadelphia. Back home, December smelled like coal smoke and wet cobblestone and the faint sweetness of roasted chestnuts sold from carts on Market Street. Here it smelled like pine resin and ice and something clean and merciless that had no name in any language she knew. The sky pressed down low and gray, the color of old pewter, and the mountains to the north rose so high and so close that for one dizzying moment, Clara Whitfield felt she had stepped off the edge of the known world entirely. She stood on the platform with one small leather bag in her right hand and a battered trunk behind her, and she looked out across the tiny station of Mercy Falls, Montana Territory, and she took one breath of that cold, clean air and told herself she was not afraid. She was afraid, but she had made her choice in Philadelphia, and she had ridden 4 days on a train to honor it, and there was no going back now. Then she saw the men. Not one man, 3. They stood in a line at the far end of the platform, shoulder to shoulder, each of them tall enough that the low-hanging wooden awning of the station barely cleared the brims of their hats. 3 men built like the mountains behind them, wide through the shoulders and deep through the chest, and steady on their feet in a way that suggested the frozen ground beneath them was an old friend rather than a hazard. The man in the center had eyes the color of amber whiskey, and he was looking directly at her with an expression she could not read. The man to his left had already turned his face away, arms crossed, jaw set, as if he had already decided something about her and found it unwelcome. The man to the right was younger than the other 2, and he was looking at the ground near his boots with the careful expression of someone preparing for a conversation he did not know how to begin. None of them moved. Clara stood on the platform steps and held her bag and waited for something she recognized. She had a letter. She had a name. She had an address written in pencil on a folded square of paper that she had read so many times the creases had gone soft. The letter said 1 man, 1 rancher, 1 E. Highways of Mercy Falls, Montana Territory. There were 3 of them. Before she could make sense of this, something small and fast exploded from behind the man in the center and came running toward her across the platform, boots skidding on the snow-dusted boards, arms outstretched. A little girl, 6 years old, maybe 7, with dark hair flying loose from a knit cap and eyes that were already bright with a certainty Clara had not yet found in herself. The child seized Clara's free hand with both of her own small gloved hands and tilted her face up and announced with the absolute authority of someone who had already settled the matter. "You came. I knew you would come. My name is Lily. You were going to sleep in the room next to mine. Papa said you would come before the snow got bad, and you did." Clara looked down at the child. She looked up at the 3 men. She looked down again. The girl named Lily was still holding her hand, waiting for the world to arrange itself around a fact she had already accepted as true. Clara Whitfield, 22 years old and 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known, stood in the cold Montana air with a child's hand in hers. And she thought, whatever else is wrong here, this part is exactly right. 3 weeks earlier, Clara had been standing in the office of Harlan Voss, and nothing had been right at all. Harlan Voss was a big man, gone soft in the way of men who had been powerful for too long, without consequence. He sat behind a mahogany desk in an office on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, surrounded by ledgers and framed certificates, and the general apparatus of a man who wanted you to understand, before he said a single word, that the room you were standing in belonged to him. He had small eyes and large hands, and he smelled of bay rum, applied too liberally, and he was reading from a document with the calm, deliberate slowness of someone who knew the person across from him had no choice but to wait. Clara waited. Her father had died 6 weeks before. William Whitfield had been a textile merchant for 20 years, a decent man in an indecent business, and he had trusted too many people and borrowed too much money, and in the end, the two things met in the worst possible way. He died in October quietly in the narrow bed of their rented rooms on Spruce Street, with Clara holding one hand and a single candle burning on the table beside him. He left her his name and his debts and a deep affection for books she had no room to store and nowhere to take. The debts belonged to Harlan Voss, $3,000, an enormous sum, a sum with the weight of a life in it. Voss finished reading. He set the document down on the desk with the precision of a man who enjoyed precision. He looked at Clara for a long moment without speaking, the way a man looks at an object he is considering purchasing. Then he smiled. "You understand the situation," he said, not a question. "I understand it," Clara said. "Good. Then you understand that I am a reasonable man and that I am prepared to be generous." He folded his hands on the desk. "There is a way to resolve this that benefits us both. You are a young woman of some education and reasonable appearance. I am a widower. I believe we could reach an arrangement." Clara looked at him. She looked at the framed certificates on the wall. She looked at the ledger with her father's name written in it in red ink. She thought about Mary Voss, who had been his wife before she died, who had been a quiet woman with shadows under her eyes that no one in the neighborhood had talked about directly, but everyone had understood. "No," Clara said. She said it simply the way you say a word you have been certain of for a long time. Voss's smile did not change, but something behind his eyes did, and it was colder than the air outside and far less honest. "Consider carefully," he said. "I have considered," Clara said. "No." She walked out of his office and down the stairs and onto Chestnut Street, and she kept her back straight and her chin level all the way to Eleanor Hatch's front door, because the one thing she had left was her dignity, and she intended to keep it. Eleanor Hatch had known Clara since she was born. She was 70 years old and sharp as a knife, and she had seen enough of the world to know when a young woman was standing at the edge of a cliff. She opened the door before Clara could knock, as if she had been waiting, and she brought her inside and sat her down at the kitchen table and put a cup of strong tea in front of her without being asked. She did not ask about the meeting with Voss. She already knew. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a folded newspaper and set it on the table in front of Clara, open to a small advertisement in the lower quarter of the back page. Clara read it. "Philadelphia Agency for Westward Matrimony, connecting respectable young women of good character with honest gentlemen of the Western Territories. Inquire within." Clara looked up. "Sometimes," Eleanor said, "far is the same as free." She said it the way old women say the truest things they know, without ceremony, without softening, just the truth set down on the table like the tea. Clara folded the newspaper and put it in her coat pocket. The offices of the Philadelphia Agency for Westward Matrimony smelled like tobacco and dried flowers and the faint, dusty scent of old correspondence, which suited them perfectly. Mrs. Harriet Cole ran the agency from a small suite of rooms above a cobbler's shop on Pine Street. She was a compact, businesslike woman who had arranged marriages from Maine to California and who looked at Clara the way a skilled carpenter looks at a piece of wood, assessing grain and soundness before committing to the work. Clara filled out the application form at a small writing desk by the window. The form asked for her age, her education, her skills, her reasons for applying. The last question gave her trouble. She sat with the pen hovering over the paper for a long moment, listening to the muffled sound of hammering from the cobbler's shop below and the soft tick of a clock on the mantel. Finally, she wrote 2 words in the box marked expectations, a home. She did not write real home. She did not add the word honest or safe or mine. She wrote 2 words and set the pen down and pushed the form across the desk. Mrs. Cole read it without expression. Then she opened a drawer and produced a thin folder and placed it on the desk between them. "I have one file that may be appropriate," she said. "A rancher in Montana Territory. He doesn't say much, but what he says appears to be true." Clara opened the folder. The letter was written on a single sheet of lined paper in ink that had dried to the color of rust. The handwriting was uneven, the letters formed with the careful deliberateness of someone who did not write often, but who wrote with full intention when they did. There were 4 sentences. She read them once, then she read them again. I have a ranch in the mountains of Montana Territory. I have a daughter 6 years old who needs a mother more than I need a wife. I offer shelter, honest work, and respect. I ask for patience, loyalty, and someone willing to make a house into a home. It was signed E. Calloway. No flattery, no promises of wealth or comfort, no description of the mountains or the beauty of the land or any of the other ornamentations that men sometimes added to such letters when they were trying to sell something. Just 4 sentences that said exactly what the situation was. Clara thought about Harlan Voss and his mahogany desk and his bay rum and his careful, terrible smile. She thought about the daughter who needed a mother. She picked up the pen and signed her name. The train west took 4 days. She rode through Ohio in rain. She rode through Illinois while the sky turned the heavy gray of iron. She rode through Iowa as the first real cold settled in, and the fields outside the window went brown, and then somewhere past the Missouri River white. She changed trains twice and slept sitting up and ate bread and hard cheese from a paper parcel and read and reread the 4 sentence letter until the creases went soft. She tried to build a picture of E. Calloway from those 4 sentences, the way you might try to build a picture of a room from the sound of footsteps inside it. Someone who worked with his hands, someone who was honest about what he needed, someone who loved his daughter enough to ask a stranger for help and humble enough to say please without using the word. The handwriting told her more than the words did. Careful, deliberate. The handwriting of someone who had learned precision through labor rather than leisure. She did not know if she could love this man. She did not know if she could love Montana. She did not know if the mountains outside the train window, which had begun to appear on the horizon like promises or threats, depending on your disposition, would feel like home or like prison. But she knew about Harlan Voss. She knew about that terrible smile. And she knew that a house that needed making into a home was already something, even if you did not know yet what it would become. Mercy Falls appeared through the train window in the late afternoon of the 4th day. She almost missed it. The station was a platform and a wooden sign in a small, peaked building that served as both ticket office and general waiting room. And beyond it, the town itself was 6 blocks of commerce and habitation clinging to the eastern slope of a valley that the mountains seemed prepared to reclaim at any moment. The train slowed. The brakes hissed. The cold pressed against the window glass. Clara picked up her bag and stood. She stood on the platform with the child named Lily still holding her hand. The 3 men had not moved. The one in the center finally did walking toward her with the measured, unhurried gait of someone who had decided what he was going to do and saw no reason to hurry about it. He was tall, very tall, broader through the shoulders than the doorway of the train car she had just stepped out of. His coat was dark wool worn and well used, and his hat was brown and pushed back on his head in a way that said he had other things to think about besides the arrangement of his appearance. His eyes were amber or close to it, and they looked at her directly and without apology. "Ethan Calloway," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, as careful as his handwriting. He nodded toward the man to his left. "This is Cole." He nodded the other direction. "And Reed." Cole had not turned back around. He was looking at the mountains, and his jaw was tight, and his arms were still crossed, and everything about his posture said he would rather be anywhere else on the surface of the earth. Reed nodded once, a small movement, and offered something that was almost a smile. "I thought," Clara said carefully, "I understood there was one." "The letter is true," Ethan said. "I am E. Calloway. This ranch is mine. But my family is all 3 of us. You would be coming into a house with 3 men in it." Clara looked at him. She looked at Cole, who was still facing away. She looked at Reed, who had now bent down to pick up the trunk she had set behind her, lifting it as if it weighed nothing. "I want to be clear about the arrangements," she said. "Separate rooms," Ethan said. "Until you say otherwise. This is a partnership, not an obligation. You will have your own space." your own door, your own key. It was almost exactly the phrasing she had hoped to hear delivered without decoration or sentiment, which was exactly why she believed it. Lily had been listening to all of this with the patience of a child who has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the adults to arrive at it. She is going to stay, Papa, Lily announced. I can tell. Cole walked past them both and climbed up to the driver's seat of the wagon without a word. Reed had already loaded the trunk. He looked at Clara and gestured toward the wagon bed and said quietly, "It gets colder after dark. We should go." Clara picked up her bag. She thought about Philadelphia and Harlan Voss and the four-sentence letter, and Eleanor Hatch and everything she had left behind, and everything she did not yet know about what she was walking toward. She climbed up into the wagon. Lily climbed in directly behind her and settled herself at Clara's side, as if she had always been there. The road to Callaway Ranch took an hour and a half in the wagon, climbing steadily up the eastern face of the valley through timber and across two frozen creek beds, and along a ridge that put the whole valley below them, like a painting you could almost believe was not real. The cold was total. Not the damp, penetrating cold of Philadelphia in winter, but a dry cold, clear and absolute, that settled into the lungs with each breath and made Clara understand for the first time in her life what it truly meant to be in a place that could kill you if you were not careful. Ethan drove. Cole sat beside him without speaking. Reed rode behind with Clara and Lily fell asleep against Clara's arm about 20 minutes into the journey, as if the question of whether she trusted this person had been settled so thoroughly that her body simply relaxed into it. Clara watched the landscape move past. She watched the pine trees thicken on both sides of the road, their branches heavy with snow that glowed blue in the fading light. She watched the sky go from gray to purple to the deep blue black of a clear winter evening. Stars appeared, more of them than she had ever seen, scattered across the dark with a careless abundance that seemed almost impossible. Reed said at one point, "The cold gets worse in January, but you get used to it." Clara said, "How long does it take?" He thought about this honestly. "2 winters," he said. The ranch appeared when the wagon rounded the last bend of the ridge road, and Clara's first sight of it was the windows, yellow light falling across packed snow, warm and square against the dark. A 2-story log building with a steep roof and a broad porch and a stone chimney from which smoke rose straight up into the windless night. Behind and to the left, a large barn and smaller outbuildings, all of them solid, all of them built to endure. Split rail fences ran in both directions into the dark until the snowfields swallowed them. It was not beautiful in the way that the word is usually used. It was something more durable than beautiful. It was the look of a place that had been built by people who understood that the land they were building on did not care whether they succeeded, and who had built it anyway and had built it to last. "This is home," Ethan said as he pulled the team to a stop. He said it without inflection, not selling it, not apologizing for it, just telling her what it was. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she climbed down from the wagon. Inside the house was warm in the way that only a well-managed fire can make a house warm, not the artificial warmth of a furnace, but the deep, reliable heat of good wood burning steadily in a good stone hearth. The front room held a fireplace broad enough to stand in a pair of chairs, a braided rug on the wooden floor, and a table with benches on both sides. The kitchen was through a door to the left, and from it came the smell of something savory that had been cooking a long time. Clara stood in the doorway and took it in. She noticed things. The curtains on the windows had been red once probably, but had faded to a soft coral that spoke of years in sun and no one to replace them. On the mantel above the fireplace, a dried flower arrangement stood in a clay pot, the flowers long dead but carefully arranged and never removed. And there in the corner near the wood box, placed with a precision that looked intentional, a pair of small women's shoes. Leather, soft-soled, low-heeled. Too small for any man in the house, set side by side as if their owner had just stepped out of them and would be back presently. Ethan came in behind her. He saw where she was looking. "Margaret," he said. "My wife. She passed 2 years ago." Clara looked at the shoes. She thought about the four-sentence letter and the daughter who needed a mother. I am sorry, she said. No need, Ethan said. Not unkind, just honest. The voice of someone who had been through the grief and come out the other side, carrying it in a way that no longer required the sympathy of strangers. Reed came in with the trunk and set it at the foot of the stairs. Cole did not come in. Clara heard him outside moving around the barn, checking things, staying busy with the kind of work that keeps a man out of rooms he does not want to be in. Lily appeared from the kitchen doorway with a wooden spoon in one hand and flour on her coat. Supper is ready, she announced. I helped. I stirred the pot. Papa said I was not allowed to add the salt again because last time it was too much, but I think it would have been fine. Reed sat down at the table. Ethan sat at the head of it. Clara sat where Lily directed her, which was in the spot directly to Lily's left. They ate venison stew with cornbread and strong coffee, and Lily talked without stopping about the horse named Captain that lived in the barn and was very old and had once bitten a man from town who had tried to shoe him improperly, and about the barn cat who was also named Captain, for reasons no one in the family could now recall, and about the time last November when Reed had climbed onto the roof to retrieve a hat that the wind had carried up there and had gotten stuck because the pitch was icy and Ethan had to get the ladder. Ethan ate and said nothing, but once very briefly the corner of his mouth shifted upward. Reed told the part of the roof story that Lily had gotten wrong, which was all of it. Cole did not come in for supper. After the dishes were done and Lily had been put to bed by her father with a ceremony that involved a specific number of stories and a specific arrangement of quilts that could not be altered. Without consequence, Reed and Clara sat in the kitchen with the last of the coffee and the fire burning low. Outside, the wind had come up, pressing against the walls of the house with a sound that was almost human. Reed was quiet for a moment. He was a careful person. Clara could tell this the way you can tell certain things about a person early without evidence through the quality of their attention. Cole, he finally said. I noticed, Clara said. It is not about you, Reed said. I want to be clear about that. Cole is not a man who takes things out on people who do not deserve it. This is about something that happened before you arrived. Clara waited. Margaret, Reed said. He looked at his coffee cup. Cole had feelings for her. Before she chose Ethan, he never said so. He never did anything about it. But we all knew, and she knew, and he knew that she knew. And then she was gone. And now here we are. He paused. He does not want anyone to replace her. Not because he thinks it is wrong exactly, but because he has not found a way yet to be at peace with himself about what happened, and seeing you here makes it harder. Clara thought about this. I am not here to replace her, she said. I know, Reed said. Cole will figure that out. It just takes him longer than it takes most people. He poured the last of the coffee into his cup and offered the pot to her, and she held out her cup, and in the warmth and quiet of the kitchen, with the wind outside and the fire low, and the rest of the house settling into sleep, Clara Whitfield felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness, not safety, not yet, but the possibility of both. Reed stood up to go. At the door to the hallway, he stopped and turned back. Winter always ends, he said. That is the one thing you can count on in Montana. However bad it gets, winter always ends. He meant more than the season, and she knew it. Clara's room was at the end of the upstairs hall, past Lily's door, and past the door of a linen closet, and at the corner of the house where two windows gave her a view of both the yard below and the dark shape of the mountains to the north. The room had a rope bed with a straw tick mattress and 3 quilts stacked on it, a small dresser with a cracked mirror, a washstand and a wooden chair. Plain, clean. A room that said, we have not forgotten you are here and we have not thought about you enough to make it comfortable, and both of those things were honest. She lit the candle on the dresser and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her bag and felt the full weight of the day settle onto her. She had crossed half a continent. She had arrived to find a situation nothing like what the letter had described and exactly like what the letter had described, depending on which part you read. She had sat at a table with 3 men who were strangers and a child who was not, and she had been given a room with a key. She had 2,000 miles of nothing between her and the life she had left. She was not going back. She stood and began to unpack the bag onto the dresser, moving by candlelight, setting her few things in place with the careful deliberateness of someone establishing territory. Her hairbrush, a small photograph of her father, a volume of verse she had carried since she was 16. When she reached to move the cracked mirror to make room for the book, the back of her hand brushed against something behind it. She pulled the mirror aside. A small book, bound in dark leather, worn smooth at the corners, tied shut with a length of cord. She picked it up, set it on the dresser, stood looking at it for a moment. She untied the cord and opened the cover. The first page held 4 lines of handwriting, neat and careful, in a hand she did not recognize. The ink had aged to a pale brown, the color of dried leaves. To whoever finds this, if you are reading these words, you have stayed long enough at Callaway Ranch for Ethan to trust you with the room that faces the mountain. That means you are someone worth knowing. There are things he has never told anyone. If you come to love him, these pages may help you understand why he is the way he is. Read slowly. Margaret Callaway, April 1870. Claire stood at the dresser with the book open in her hands for a long time. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall again. Soft and steady, the kind of snow that falls with patience as if it has nowhere better to be. She closed the book without reading further. She set it on the dresser beside her father's photograph. She blew out the candle and lay down under 3 quilts in the cold, dark room at the corner of the house. She did not sleep for a long time. The days that followed had a shape to them she had not anticipated. She had expected to feel like a guest. She expected to move carefully around the edges of a life already in motion, unsure of her place in it, asking permission before she touched anything. Instead, what happened was different. Lily arrived at her door the first morning at 5:30 before the sun was up and informed her that breakfast was at 6 and that Papa liked his coffee very dark and that Reed took his with a little sugar and that Cole did not eat breakfast in the house most days, but when he did, he liked things hot. Clara filed this information away and went downstairs and made coffee and fried cornmeal cakes and sliced the salt pork she found hanging in the cellar. And when Ethan came in from the barn, he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the table and then looked at her, and something in his face shifted by a degree that she would not have noticed if she had not been watching. He sat down and ate. He did not say it was good. He did not say anything about the food at all, but he ate all of it and he poured a second cup of the coffee without being asked, and that was enough. Reed laughed out loud when he came in and saw the table. Not at her, but with her in the way of someone who has been hoping for exactly this and is pleased to find it arrived. Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7 after the others had finished and looked at the pan on the stove where she had left the remaining cornmeal cakes warm by the fire. He said nothing. He took a plate. He sat at the far end of the table and ate alone. Clara washed the dishes and did not look at him, but she noted that he had eaten. On the 4th day, there was a crisis in the barn. She heard it from the kitchen while she was making bread, a low sustained commotion from the direction of the cattle pen that was different from the ordinary sounds of animals. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the kitchen window. Through the frost on the glass, she could see the barn door standing open and a lamp moving inside and Reed's figure moving fast in a way that said something was wrong. She tied her apron tighter and went. The problem was a cow. She was a large animal, nearly black, lying on her side in the straw, with her legs moving in the weak, ineffective way of an animal in serious distress. A calf was coming early. The position was wrong. Reed was kneeling in the straw beside her with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his face showing the particular expression of a man who knows what needs to happen and is not entirely sure he knows how to make it happen. Ethan and Cole were both on the far side of the property beyond calling distance. Reed looked up when Clara came in. "I do not suppose," he said, "that you have any experience with this." "Some," Clara said. She said it in the same tone she said most things, level and without unnecessary qualification. She knelt in the straw. For the next 40 minutes, she did what her father had watched their neighbor's elderly veterinarian do a dozen times in the alley behind their building, back when she was 12 years old, and her father had insisted she watch instead of look away, because understanding how living things worked was not something to be squeamish about. She was not a veterinarian. She had never done this herself, but she had watched with the careful attention of someone who understood that what you observe precisely enough becomes something you can use. Reed helped. He did what she told him to do quickly and without argument, which was the most useful thing a person could do in that barn. The calf arrived just after 6 in the morning, small and wet and trembling, and within 10 minutes it was on its feet. Clara sat back in the straw and took a breath. Reed looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the calf. Then he looked at her again. "Two winners," he said. The phrase meant something different now. When Ethan came back from the far property and Reed told him, Ethan listened to the whole account without speaking. Then he walked to the kitchen where Clara was washing her hands and stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she turned around and looked back. He did not say it was remarkable. He did not say he was impressed. He said one word: good. From Ethan Calloway, that word carried the weight of a longer speech. 2 weeks after she arrived, Ethan took her into Mercy Falls for supplies. The town was small, and it knew itself to be small, and it compensated for this with the particular attentiveness that small communities direct toward anything unusual. Clara felt the attention the moment she stepped down from the wagon. It came from behind store windows and from the doorways of the feed merchant and the dry goods store, and from a cluster of women near the post office who stopped talking when they saw her, and then after a pause that said more than any words they could have chosen, resumed talking in a quieter register. Inside Henderson's general store, Ethan moved through the aisles with the ease of a man who had been shopping here for years and expected no difficulty. Clara walked beside him with a list. She did not look at the women near the far counter. She did not need to. She could hear the voice of the larger one, Mrs. Peterson, carrying across the store with the practiced technique of someone who wanted to be overheard without being accused of intending it. Mail order. From Philadelphia, they say. Living up at Calloway Ranch with all three of them. Clara kept her eyes on the shelf in front of her. She counted cans of beans. She breathed steadily. She had dealt with worse than this. At the counter, Henderson tallied their purchases and paused in that particular way that suggested the pause was not about arithmetic. Ethan set both hands flat on the counter and looked at Henderson directly. "Miss Whitfield is under my family's protection," he said. "Her credit is as good as mine." It was not a conversation. It was a statement. Henderson understood this. "Yes, sir," Henderson said. They walked out. On the boardwalk, Clara stopped. There was a man across the street who was not doing anything. That was what she noticed first. In a town this small in weather, this cold, everyone outside was moving, going somewhere, doing something. This man was standing still. He wore a dark coat that was too fine for Mercy Falls, and he had his hands in his pockets, and he was looking directly at her with small, steady eyes that she recognized in the same instant that she wished she did not. The cold that ran through her then had nothing to do with December. He was gone when she looked again, quick as a shadow passing. "Clara," Ethan said from beside her. "I am fine," and she said, "the cold." She had said it before she thought it through, and as she said it, she knew it was not quite true, and she knew from the brief change in his expression that he had heard the difference. He did not press it. He handed her up into the wagon. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, and they drove back through the gray light of the afternoon toward the mountains. She sat beside him and watched the road and did not say what she had seen. But she knew the face. She knew it from the carpeted hallway outside Harlan Voss's office, from the way he had looked at her across a mahogany desk 3 weeks ago with that careful, terrible smile. She knew it the way you know a threat even before you can name it. He was here. She did not yet know what he intended. She did not tell Ethan. Not that evening. She told herself she was waiting until she was sure. In the second week, Lily got sick. It came on fast the way sickness comes to children, A little cough in the afternoon that by nightfall had become a fever that made the child's small body radiate heat like a coal. Clara heard it through the wall between their rooms. She rose in the dark and went into Lily's room and touched the child's forehead with the back of her hand and felt the dry, burning heat of it. She went downstairs and heated water. She found chamomile in the kitchen cupboard and honey in a jar, and she made a tea and brought it back upstairs and sat on the edge of Lily's bed and got her to drink most of it. She soaked a cloth in the cool water from the washstand and laid it on the child's forehead. She pulled the chair close to the bed and sat in it. She stayed. Every half hour, she replaced the cloth. Between cloth changes, she talked in a low, steady voice, not really telling stories, just talking the way you talk to a small creature in distress so that they know they are not alone. She talked about the train ride west and the way the Missouri River had looked from the bridge, brown and wide and serious, and about the smell of the pine forest in Wyoming coming through the train window, and about the moment she had first seen the mountains and how it had felt. Lily drifted in and out of sleep. Once she opened her eyes in the small hours and looked at Clara directly with fever-bright eyes and said in the pragmatic way of a child stating a fact, "You did not go away." "No," Clara said, "I am here." "I thought you might go away." "I did not go away," Clara said. Lily closed her eyes again. Sometime around 3 in the morning, Clara got up to replace the cloth and turned from the washstand and saw the hallway through the open door. There was a man standing at the end of it in the dark near the top of the stairs. Not moving, just there. She could see the shape of him, large and still, and after a moment she understood who it was. Ethan. He had not come to the doorway. He had not knocked. He had not called out or asked if help was needed. He stood at the end of the hall in the dark and watched over his daughter through the only means available to him that would not violate the agreement he had made, and he had apparently been doing this for some time. Clara looked at him for a moment. He did not speak. She turned back to the washstand and wrung out the cloth and went back to the chair by the bed. By first light, Lily's fever had broken. The child slept deeply and her breathing was easy, and her forehead under Clara's hand was cool and damp. Clara stood and stretched and rolled her neck and walked out into the hall. Ethan was there, still leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his eyes finding hers the moment she appeared. He stepped forward and walked past her to look in at Lily one long look to see for himself that she was breathing well and sleeping peacefully. Then he turned around. He looked at Clara. He looked at the chair pulled close to the bed and the wrung-out cloths on the washstand and the cold cup of chamomile tea and the other evidence of a night spent in service to his daughter. He looked at Clara again. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, that was all. The voice of a man who said things once and meant them entirely. Clara nodded. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in the gray light of the Montana morning and listened to the wind come down off the mountains and thought about the child sleeping peacefully in the next room and the man standing in the dark hallway all night because he would not break his word. A house that needed making into a home. She looked at the leather-bound book on the dresser beside her father's photograph, the book in Margaret Calloway's handwriting that began with an invitation and ended with a promise. She reached out and picked it up. She began to read. January came down on Calloway Ranch like a hand pressing everything flat. The cold that settled in during the first week of the new year was a different animal from the cold of December. December's cold was a warning. January's cold was a fact. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read numbers that had no equivalent in Clara's experience, and the mountains to the north disappeared entirely behind a wall of gray that was not quite cloud and not quite storm, but was both things at once, and the wind that came down off them at night made the logs of the house creak and settle in a way that sounded, if you were new to it and lying awake in the dark, like something trying to get in. You got used to it. That was what Reed had told her, and it was true, though the getting used to it happened slowly and without announcement in the same way that all real adjustments happen through repetition and necessity rather than intention. The days had a shape to them now. Ethan was up before 4:30 before the sun had any intention of appearing. His boots on the stairs, a sound she learned to recognize as the first signal that the day had begun. He lit the kitchen fire and then went to the barn, and by the time Clara came downstairs at 5, the kitchen was warm, and the coffee water was heating, and the only evidence of him was the open back door and the deep footprints in the snow leading toward the outbuilding was. She learned his coffee quickly, dark and strong, 2 cups before the first full sentence, and she made it that way without being asked. And this small act of attention was never remarked upon, but also never went unnoticed. She knew this because of the brief stillness that came over him when he picked up the cup the first morning. She made it correctly, a stillness like the moment before a man speaks when he has decided not to. Cole was harder to read and harder to feed. He appeared and disappeared according to a schedule that had nothing to do with the rhythms of the rest of the household. But when he came in for meals, he ate with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that food was fuel and had no interest in pretending otherwise. He did not speak to Clara directly in those early weeks. He did not speak around her either, which was different from ignoring her. It was more like the careful way you move around something fragile that you have not yet decided what to do with. Clara respected this. She did not push into it. She left food warm for him when he came in late, and she did not comment on this, and he did not thank her for it, and they understood each other perfectly on these terms. Reed was the language in the middle, the translation between the things Ethan meant and did not say, and the things Cole felt and refused to name. He taught Clara how the wood-burning range worked, sitting at the kitchen table, while she stood at the stove, explaining the relationship between the damper and the flue, and the difference in burn rates between the pine they used for quick heat and the harder ash logs they saved for the overnight fire. He told her this with the precise enthusiasm of someone explaining something that genuinely interested him, and Clara understood quickly that Reed Calloway was the kind of man who found most things genuinely interesting, which was rarer than it appeared and worth more than it cost. They traded books. She had brought a collection of verse and a volume of short stories from Philadelphia. He had Dickens and Twain and a worn encyclopedia of natural history that he had clearly read many times. They discussed these things in the evenings after supper while Lily drew pictures at the kitchen table, and Ethan sat near the fire with the ranch accounts, and Cole whittled in the chair by the window. And the fire spoke in its low, continuous voice, and the wind pressed against the walls, and inside the house there was warmth and light in the slow, careful construction of something that did not yet have a name, but was beginning to have a shape. Clara read Margaret's diary in the afternoons when Lily napped and the men were outside and the house was quiet. She read it slowly as Margaret had asked her to, a few pages at a time, setting it down and sitting with what she had read before picking it up again. It was the most honest document she had ever encountered. Margaret Calloway had written the way certain people live, without performance, without the social editing that most of us apply to everything we say and write and think. She wrote about Ethan with a precision that was also a form of love, documenting the specific architecture of who he was, how he expressed care through labor, how his silences were never empty, how the quieter he became, the harder he was working on something inside himself that he could not yet put into words. She wrote about Reed with affection and a kind of admiring bewilderment, noting that he was the only person she had ever known who seemed genuinely at home inside his own head, as if the interior life he carried around was a place he had arranged to his satisfaction and was content to live in. And she wrote about Cole, not in the way you write about something shameful, in the way you write about something complicated and real that you have carried for a long time and have not found a better place to put. She wrote that she had known almost from the beginning that Cole had feelings for her that he had chosen to contain rather than act on because of Ethan, because of loyalty, because Cole Calloway was the kind of man who would eat his own grief before he let it become someone else's problem. She wrote that she had chosen Ethan completely and truly and without regret, and that this did not make the other truth less true or less heavy. She wrote that she had prayed in the private and particular way she prayed, that Cole would someday find a woman who could see through that wall he had built and find the person standing on the other side of it, and that when that happened, she hoped he would let her in instead of deciding in advance that the door should stay closed. Clara set the book down after reading this passage and sat for a long time looking at the window at the white mountains in the gray sky, and thought about men who carry their grief quietly and women who see through walls. It was 3 days after she read this passage that the book fell. She was moving quickly through the upstairs hallway, carrying it back from the linen closet where she had stowed it for safekeeping when Cole came around the corner from the top of the stairs, and they nearly collided. The book went from her hands and hit the floor and opened to the page she had marked Last Margaret's careful handwriting, visible and unmistakable from where Cole stood. He picked it up before she could. He looked at it for 1 second, two, just long enough. Then he set it back in her hands. He did not say anything. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the air between them had a weight to it that was not quite accusation and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. And Clara met his eyes and held them and did not apologize and did not explain because neither thing was right. Cole walked past her and down the stairs. But that evening at supper, he spoke to her for the first time without being required to. He asked her to pass the salt. It was 4 words, and it was nothing. And it was the beginning of something, and everyone at the table understood this, even Lily, who looked up from her cornbread with the alert expression of a child who has been waiting for a particular event and has now observed its arrival. It was Lily who named her. It happened at supper on an evening in mid-January between the salt pork and the second helping of beans, in the completely unself-conscious way that children do the things that adults spend weeks circling around with elaborate caution. Lily turned to ask Clara something about the drawing she had been working on, and she said simply and without preamble, "Mama, Clara, do you know how to draw horses?" The table went still. Not uncomfortable still. A different kind of still, the kind that happens when something true has been said aloud for the first time, and everyone in the room needs a moment to understand what it means. Lily looked around at the adults. She was 6 years old, and she had the unsentimental practicality of a child who has grown up in a house where things were stated plainly, and she could not understand why they were all looking at her like that. "Mama Margaret is in heaven," she said with the clear matter-of-fact logic of someone explaining something obvious. "Mama Clara is here. I have 2 mamas, but they live in different places. Is that wrong?" Ethan looked at his daughter for a long moment. The expression on his face was not one Clara had seen before, something between grief and wonder. The look of a man watching something he had been afraid to hope for. "No," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "That is not wrong at all, Lily Bird." Cole stood up to get more coffee. He was at the stove for a moment longer than it took to pour it. Reed watched Clara with quiet attention, and when she met his eyes, he nodded once, a small movement that said more than he would have put into words. Clara looked at Lily, who had already moved on and was now explaining the specific anatomy of the horse she needed help drawing. She felt something settle inside her chest, something that had been suspended for a long time, and land. Victoria Marsh arrived at the end of January. She came on horseback alone in the early morning, which told Clara something about her before she had spoken a word. A woman who rode alone through Montana Territory in January was not a woman who could be intimidated by the ordinary things that intimidate people. She was in her mid-30s, brown-haired with the sharp, fine bones of someone who had once been pretty, in a precise way, and was now something more durable, and she had Margaret's eyes without Margaret's warmth in them. She dismounted at the porch, and Ethan met her at the door, and they went inside, and Clara kept Lily occupied in the kitchen with bread dough and tried not to hear the conversation in the front room, and heard most of it anyway. Victoria spoke like a woman who had prepared what she was going to say and intended to say all of it without interruption. She talked about blood. She talked about family. She talked about Lily belonging to the marsh line and about the environment at Callaway Ranch, being, she said the phrase with a careful precision that told Clara it had been given to her by a lawyer not conducive to the moral and domestic stability appropriate for a child of Lily's age. She talked about her connections in the territorial government and about the legal instruments available to concerned family members. Ethan's responses were brief. Clara could not hear the words, only the tone, which was the same measured, unhurried tone he used for everything, and which had in it now a quality like cold iron. When Victoria came through to the kitchen, she looked at Clara the way a judge looks at evidence that has been entered at a trial she did not expect to attend. "You are the mail order woman," she said. "I am Clara Whitfield," Clara said. "Are you married to him yet?" "Not yet." Victoria looked around the kitchen. She looked at Lily, who had gone quiet and watchful at the table, reading the room with the particular accuracy of a child who has been around adult tension long enough to know what it smells like. Victoria's expression changed briefly, then losing some of its prepared quality, and something that might have been genuine grief moved through it and was gone. "Lily," she said. Lily looked at her aunt. She did not move from her spot at the table. She put one hand on Clara's arm without looking at her. Victoria Marsh saw this. Something shifted in her face. "I will be back," she said. She said it to Ethan, who had come to the kitchen doorway, not to Clara. "And when I come back, I will have the paperwork with me. I am prepared to take this to the territorial court." She left. They heard the horse moving away through the snow, and then there was the silence of the house after a storm that has not quite passed. That night, Lily would not go to sleep. Clara sat on the edge of her bed in the lamplight while the child held the small wooden doll, the one Ethan had taken from the shelf on their first evening, and placed in Lily's hands without explanation, the doll that had been Margaret's and that he had saved and that Clara now understood was his most significant act of trust in her, more significant than the letter or the room or the key. "That woman wants to take me away," Lily said. "She wants to see you safe," Clara said. "That is a different thing. I am safe here. I know. Are you going to let her take me?" Clara took the child's small hand. She held it in both of hers. "No," she said. "Your papa will not allow that, and neither will I." Lily looked at her for a long time. Then she said with the directness that was the most Margaret thing about her, "I am not worried about me. I am worried about you." Clara looked at this 6-year-old child with her father's amber eyes and her mother's clarity and felt something tighten in her throat. "You do not need to worry about me," she said. "Someone should," Lily said with perfect, simple logic, and closed her eyes. "The wolves came at the end of January. There had been signs for a week," Reed said, tracks in the perimeter snow, a nervousness in the horses that he had been monitoring. The winter had been bad enough that game in the high country was scarce, and the packs were pushing their ranges down, taking risks they would not ordinarily take. He had told Ethan and Cole. They had all been watching. But the night the pack came down to the livestock pen, Ethan was on the far side of the property, checking the ice on the creek that fed the cattle water. A job that could not wait. Cole had seen the tracks and was already out and moving when the sound started, the low rolling commotion of frightened animal sheep first, and then the cattle catching the fear and amplifying it into something that filled the whole night. Clara woke to it and understood it. She was out of bed and pulling on her coat before she had fully thought the action through. She took the lamp from the dresser and took the Springfield rifle from the corner where Reed had shown her it hung, and went down the stairs and out the back door into the cold that hit her like a wall. Reed was already at the pen gate, throwing his weight against it, keeping it closed against the panicking sheep on the other side. He looked at her when she appeared, and in the flickering lamplight, his expression was past surprise and into something more practical. "Take the other side of the gate," he said. She put her shoulder to it. The animals on the other side were frantic, throwing themselves against the fence boards, and it took everything she had to hold position. Outside the pen beyond the fence line, she could hear the wolves, a sound unlike any animal sound she had experienced. Low and purposeful, and carrying in it a kind of cold intelligence. Cole was at the far corner of the pen with his rifle. 3 shots, measured and deliberate, not panicked. The sound changed. The wolves pulled back. It took 30 minutes to get the animals quieted. They lost 1 sheep before Cole drove the pack off, and a goat had a wound along its flank that needed attention. They worked by a lamplight in the trampled snow of the pen, Reed holding animals, while Clara examined them, Cole standing at the fence line, watching the dark for movement. When the worst of it was done and the animals were settling, Cole came and crouched beside her in the straw and held the lamp while she cleaned and wrapped the goat's wound. They worked without speaking in the closed wordless collaboration of people doing something that needs doing. And after a while, Cole said without looking at her, "You did not go inside." "No," Clara said. "When most people hear that sound in the dark," he said, "they go inside." "These are your animals," Clara said. She kept working. "Your barn, your ranch." She looked up at him briefly. "My home now, at least that is what I intend." Cole was quiet for a moment. In the lamplight, his face was harder to read than usual, the shadows deepening the angles of it. But his eyes had something in them that had not been there before. Not warmth exactly, but the beginning of a possibility. "Margaret wrote about someone like you," he said. Clara kept her hands steady on the bandage. "I know," she said. He looked at her. He nodded once slowly, the way men like Cole Calloway nod when they have finished making a decision they have been working on for some time. "You are not what I thought of," he said. "What did you think I was?" "Someone who came because they needed somewhere to be." "That is not entirely wrong," Clara said. "No," Cole said, "but it is not the whole of it." He stood, taking the lamp with him, leaving her enough light to finish. "That is what I was wrong about." He walked back to the fence line and stood watch for the rest of the night. 3 days after the wolf attack, Henderson at the general store passed a message to Clara with the careful neutrality of a man determined not to have an opinion about its contents. She read it in the wagon on the way home, and the cold she felt then had nothing to do with February. The handwriting was one she recognized. Even after 3 weeks and 1,000 miles, it was familiar, that careful, deliberate script that suggested a man who wrote things down the way he did everything with the patience of someone who had learned that patience was simply applied control. It said, "Come alone to the old mill house at the north edge of town on Thursday at first light, or I will ensure that the men who house you lose everything they have. Your father's name appears on documents connecting their land title to unresolved debt. You have obligations that do not expire because you crossed a state line. Come alone. Do not tell them. HV." She sat with this for a long time. She sat with it that evening and the next morning, and through another day of ordinary ranch life, of coffee and bread, and Lily's stories and Reed's books, and Ethan's silences that she was learning to read as well as any language she had ever studied. She sat with the shape of the threat and turned it over and looked at it from all sides and tried to find the angle from which it was not as bad as it appeared. She did not find one. What Harlan Voss was describing, landed obligations arising from her father's name being attached to some form of debt or contract, was a legal mechanism she did not have the knowledge to evaluate or refute. She did not know what documents her father had signed. She did not know what Voss might have arranged or altered or created. She knew only that a man who would forge a smile across a mahogany desk and call it an arrangement would not hesitate to forge other things. She went to find Reed. He was in the small room behind the kitchen that served as his office and library, bent over a letter he was writing, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway and read her expression with the efficiency of someone used to translating things. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She put the note on the desk between them. He read it again. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man rearranging furniture in his head. "I am not going alone," Clara said. "No," Reed agreed. "Ethan needs to know," she said. Reed looked at her. "Yes, but let me look at this first, the land claim. I need to understand what he actually has before we walk into a meeting and give him the advantage of knowing we came unprepared." He paused and something careful moved across his face. "When you arrived with a complicated history I did not yet understand, I wrote to Philadelphia for records of your father's business dealings. I wanted to know what we were dealing with before it found us. Those letters have not yet returned. But I need to see what is in this document before Thursday." He stood up and went to the battered wooden chest in the corner that held the ranch's legal documents. He pulled it open and began going through it with the focused attention of someone who had taught himself to read law out of necessity, which was exactly what he had done. Clara sat and watched him work, and felt for the first time since she had read the note Something that was not quite relief, but was the thing that comes before relief, the sense that she was not handling this alone. Thursday came with a sky the color of pewter and a cold that put its fingers into every gap in a coat. The old mill house stood at the north edge of Mercy Falls, where the creek bent away from town, its wheel long still, its walls gray with age and stripped of paint by 20 winters. Harlan Voss stood inside it when they arrived. He was not alone. He had two men with him standing at the back wall with the professional stillness of men paid to stand in rooms and make the air heavier. He looked at Reed with an expression that said he had been expecting this complication and had already decided it did not change anything. "I said alone," he said. "I read what you said," Claire replied. Voss took a breath through his nose and adjusted his expression and produced the folder of documents he had clearly been carrying since Philadelphia. He went through them at the table by the millhouse window, his voice even, and practiced the voice of a man who had given this speech in several variations and knew where all the weight fell. The center of it was a land deed attachment, a certificate of mineral rights, he said, which her father had purchased 7 years earlier, covering extraction rights over the western face of the Beartooth Range. This certificate, he explained, had been secured as collateral at the time of the Whitfield loan. Since the loan had not been repaid, the mineral rights now belonged to Voss, and surveys conducted by his hired assessors suggested that these mineral rights covered ground directly within the boundaries of Callaway Ranch, under which, according to the same assessors, there existed a gold-bearing vein of significant value. He put the certificate on the table. He was watching Clara's face. Reed picked it up. He read it for a long time. Then he asked to see the notarization. Voss pointed to it. Reed looked at the notary's seal. He looked at the signature of the two required witnesses. He set it back down on the table and looked at it for another moment. "This was notarized by the Wyoming Territorial Office," Reed said. It was. The Wyoming office that was closed for 7 months in 1869 following the commissioner's death. Voss's face did not change, but something behind it did. Additionally, Reed said, one of the witnesses named here is a man named Franklin Cord. He tapped the signature. Mr. Cord died in Denver in the fall of 1868, approximately a year before the date on this document. The silence in the mill house was complete. Outside, the creek moved under its lid of ice, and somewhere in the timber, a branch gave way under its load of snow. "I would strongly advise you," Reed said, and his voice had not raised or changed its pace by a single degree, "to consider your next action with great care. 2 of the witnesses on this document cannot have signed it, and I am not yet finished looking." He looked at Voss without expression. "You are in a territory where Judge Morrison has been sitting the bench for 26 years and has a well-established antipathy toward men who arrive with papers that do not hold together under examination." Voss looked at Reed. He looked at Clara. When he spoke, his voice had changed, some of the careful casing gone from it. "Thursday of next week, he said to Clara, "or I take this to the territorial court myself and let them sort out what is genuine and what is not. These things take time, and in that time your arrangement here becomes very public and very uncomfortable." He gathered his documents and walked out. Reed waited until the sound of the horses had faded north. Then he turned to Clara. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," Clara said. "Tell me honestly, can he make this difficult?" "He can make it take time," Reed said. "That is what men like Voss do when they cannot win outright. They make things take time and hope the other side runs out of patience or resources first." He paused. "We need to tell Ethan tonight." "I know," Clara said. "You should have told him sooner." "I know," she said again. Reed looked at her not unkindly. "He is not going to be angry, not at you, but he will be quiet for a while, which looks the same from the outside." Supper that evening was the quietest meal since Clara had arrived. She told him everything. Harlan Voss, the first note, the mill house meeting, what Reed had found in the documents. She laid it out plainly and without embellishment in the same register she used for practical things because it was a practical problem and it deserved that kind of honesty. Ethan listened to all of it without speaking. His face did not change, which was not the same as his not feeling it. Clara had learned this. The range of expression he permitted himself was narrow and controlled, but behind it the weather moved, and you could read it if you knew where to look. When she finished, Cole set down his fork. "No one takes what we built," he said. Quiet, absolute, the voice of someone stating a physical law. Reed was already thinking ahead, laying out the steps methodically, the letters he would continue pressing to Philadelphia, the judge he would approach, the legal filing that would preempt Voss's ability to bring the forgery argument to court first. Ethan looked at Clara across the table. "Why did you not tell me when you first saw him?" he said. "Because I thought I could manage it," she said. "I was wrong. I am sorry." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said in the same measured voice he used for everything, "This is not your fault, and we will find a way." It was not an absolution. It was something more useful than an absolution. It was the voice of someone who had already moved past the question of blame and was looking at the road ahead. Cole spoke again low and to no one in particular, looking at the table. "No one takes anything from this family again." Lily, sitting between Reed and Clara, looked around at the adults with her careful eyes, reading the room the way she always did, and then put her small hand on top of Clara's where it rested on the table. She did not say anything. She just kept her hand there. 3 days after the Millhouse meeting, Pastor Harold Williams arrived at Callaway Ranch. He came in the afternoon when the light was flat and gray, and the temperature had dropped enough that the snow on the porch stairs had gone glassy. He wore his church-going coat and his expression of settled moral authority, and he stood in the front room with his hat in his hands and delivered his message with the practiced clarity of someone who had been preparing it since the first week Clara arrived. The territorial governor, Williams explained, had initiated a campaign to enforce laws against what he called improper domestic arrangements in the frontier territories. Mercy Falls had been specifically identified as a community of concern. The school board had already raised the matter of Lily's enrollment in connection with the irregularities of the household situation. And Williams himself, as the moral and spiritual authority of the community, felt it his duty to inform Ethan directly he had 1 week to formalize his arrangement with Clara through a proper Christian marriage, or to dissolve the arrangement entirely and send her away. He presented a written notice to that effect from the governor's office. Ethan did not stand when Williams spoke. He sat in his chair by the fire with his hands on his knees and listened to the full speech without interruption. When Williams finished, Ethan looked at the notice. He set it on the side table. "I will marry her," Ethan said, "on my schedule, in my way, not on a political timetable issued by men who have never spent a winter at this altitude." Williams leaned forward slightly. "Ethan, the community's regard for you and your family is not unconditional. There are consequences to defying this." "I know," Ethan said. "Thank you for coming, Harold. Good afternoon." Williams looked at him for a moment. He looked at Clara, who was standing in the kitchen doorway. He put his hat back on and left. Clara watched the door close. She was still holding the dish towel she had been carrying when Williams arrived. Cole spoke from behind her, from the direction of the kitchen table where he had been sitting through all of it. "Let him come back as many times as he likes," Cole said. "He does not have a key to this house." The blizzard that took Lily started as an afternoon snow. By 2 o'clock, the flakes were soft and intermittent, and the sky was the particular shade of white that is not yet a storm but is making its intentions clear. By 3:30, it had become something else. By 4 o'clock, when Clara called Lily in for her afternoon meal and heard nothing, it was a wall of white that reduced the yard to the size of a closed fist. The child was not in her room, not in the kitchen, not in the barn, not in the woodshed, not in any of the outbuildings within calling distance. Her coat was on its hook, and her heavier boots were in the corner of the mudroom, and the smaller boots she wore for quick outdoor trips were gone. Clara was down the porch steps before she had processed the full shape of the situation. The snow was already deep enough to slow her, and the wind was coming from the north, and the cold was a physical thing with edges to it. She had heard Lily talk about the fox, a white-tailed fox that appeared sometimes in the timber line to the east in the late afternoon, a creature that Lily had decided was her particular friend, on the basis of having seen it twice. Lily had described its habits and its likely home, and its relationship to her with the detailed certainty of a child who has decided a fact and sees no reason to doubt it. And in the part of Clara's mind that had been paying attention to Lily, with the careful consistency of someone who understood that children tell you everything important, if you listen correctly, that detail had landed and stayed. She went east. Ethan found the child's tracks going that direction and followed them. Cole looped north to cut off any chance of the child drifting toward the ravine. Reed went south toward the creek. They split in the practiced way of people who have executed emergency separations before moving without discussion because there was no time for it. Clara went east into the timber. The trees reduced the wind to a kind of moaning interference, and the snow between them was still deep, but easier to move through without the open field resistance. She called Lily's name and heard nothing back except the sound of her own voice absorbed by white. She kept moving. She was wearing her heavy coat and her good boots, and both were adequate, and she knew this, but also knew that adequate had a time limit. She found the child 11 minutes after entering the timber. Lily was sitting at the base of a spruce tree with its broad lower branches drooping under snow, creating a partial shelter. She had apparently understood that she was lost and had chosen to stop rather than wander further, which was exactly the right decision, and which spoke well of either her instincts or something Ethan had told her. She was very cold. The smaller boots were not made for this kind of exposure, and her feet had gone to that dangerous stage where cold becomes its own kind of warmth. Clara did not say anything beyond "I am here," and "you are safe," and those only once each. Then she lifted the child and wrapped her coat around both of them and began walking back. She was 100 yards from the timber line when she heard Ethan. He came from the left, moving fast through the snow, with the lamp swinging in his hand and his voice carrying the names of both of them, Lily first and then Clara. And when he saw them, the lamp slowed and then he was there. He took the child from Clara's arms. He held Lily against his chest with one arm, checking her with his free hand, her face, her hands, her feet, assessing rapidly and methodically, while the snow came down around them. Then he shrugged off his coat, the heavy oiled canvas coat that had survived 10 Montana winters, and put it around both of them, around Clara and Lily, together, and held it closed with one arm around Clara's shoulders. They walked back like that. Clara did not try to move out from under his arm. She was cold enough that the warmth of him was not something to be considered, only something to be used, and she was practical enough to use it. Lily said from somewhere inside the folds of coat and wool, "I saw the fox, Papa. It went into the trees and I followed it, and then I could not see the fence anymore." "I know," Ethan said. "I stopped when I knew I was lost, like you told me." "I know," he said. "You did right." They came into the yard. Cole appeared from the north side and took in the three of them and changed direction without a word, moving toward the house to prepare it. Reed was already inside. Clara could see through the kitchen window, moving with purpose. At the porch steps, Ethan's arm did not move from her shoulders until she had both feet on the porch boards. Then he shifted Lily more securely and looked at Clara, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, a version of the controlled exterior that had briefly lost its containment, the look of someone who has finished being afraid and has not yet decided what to feel next. She understood. She went inside. By nightfall, the fever had come. Not Lily's. Lily had warmed quickly and eaten well, and was, by the time Reed had checked her over, unlikely to suffer more than a chill memory of the afternoon. The child's constitution was her father's, solid and adaptable, and she was already describing the fox to Reed with great detail when Clara went upstairs. It was Clara who had been outside too long in a coat reduced to a single layer around a child. It was Clara who felt the familiar signal of fever beginning, that particular interior heat that comes as a warning before it comes as a problem. She changed clothes and lay down on her bed and told herself it would pass. It did not pass. By midnight, it was serious. She was aware of the room and fragments of the cold weight of the quilts and the heat coming from somewhere inside herself that had nothing to do with warmth of the candle on the dresser and the window with its rectangle of dark blue winter night. She was aware of the chair beside the bed and of the person in it, Reed for the first part of the night, then Reed's voice somewhere outside the door in quiet conversation. Then a different presence in the chair. She understood who it was by the size of the shadow on the wall and by the quality of the stillness, which was different from Reed's stillness. Reed was still in the way of a man thinking. Cole was still in the way of a mountain. His hand was on hers at some point. She was not sure when it had gotten there, or whether it had been a deliberate act, or simply the way a man's hand moves when he is sitting close to someone in distress, and his body does the thing his pride will not let him decide. She was too tired to analyze it. She left it. She woke at some point in the deep middle of the night. The candle burned to a stub, and Cole was still there. He had not moved from the chair. The expression on his face in the last of the candlelight was one she had not seen and would not have known to expect. Something open, something that had given up on being guarded for the night. She tried to sit up. "Don't," he said, "Cole." "Clara," he said. Just her name. The first time he had said it, she realized. Not Miss Whitfield, not the woman. Her name in his voice said with the same directness he gave to everything that he decided mattered. "Sleep," he said. She did. Somewhere across the hall in the corner room, Reed was not sleeping. He was working by lamplight at the small desk he had carried from his room. Going through the box of ranch documents and laying them alongside the sheets that had arrived that afternoon from Philadelphia, the authenticated copies he had requested weeks earlier, when Clara first arrived, in the shape of her past, had seemed like something worth understanding before it became something worth defending. He found it at 4 in the morning, not one discrepancy. Three places where the forgery had introduced errors that only someone who knew William Whitfield's authentic signature across multiple authenticated documents would be able to identify. The capital K in the authentic signature appeared with a specific lean and loop across all 23 verified papers. In Voss's certificate, it was subtly different, consistent with itself, but inconsistent with everything that was genuinely William Whitfield's hand. He laid the comparison sheets out on the desk and looked at them and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has found the thread that unravels the whole cloth. He sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought for a moment about what came next. Then he picked up his pen and began to write the letter that would go to the territorial court and the one that would go to Judge Daniel Morrison, who had been on the bench in this valley for 26 years. And who Reed had always found to be a man who considered forgery considerably more offensive than unconventional domestic arrangements. Down the hall behind the closed door of the room at the corner, Clara Whitfield slept, and the fever did its slow work, and Cole Calloway sat in the chair beside her and kept watch the way men keep watch when they have stopped pretending they have no reason to. Outside, the blizzard had ended. The stars were out. The whole white world lay still and cold and perfect under them, waiting for what the morning would bring. Clara recovered in 3 days. Not slowly, the way some people recover from fever, retreating into a long, pale convalescence that requires managing. She recovered the way she did most things steadily and without making a production of it. By the second morning, she was sitting up. By the third, she was downstairs at the kitchen table with both hands around a cup of coffee, watching the snowlight come through the window and feeling the particular clarity that follows. Fever, the world gone sharp and clean at its edges, the way it always looks when you have been away from it for a while and come back. Ethan came in from the barn. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her, and she turned and looked at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he crossed to the stove and poured his own coffee and sat down at the table across from her and set both hands around the cup and looked at her with a direct, steady attention that she had learned by now was not appraisal. It was something closer to accounting. The act of a man who checks on the things he values. "There is something I should have told you," he said. Clara waited. "When the agency sent me your application," he said, "they sent me the complete file, not a summary, everything. Your father's situation, the debt, the circumstances with Voss." He paused and his hands did not move on the cup. "I contacted a lawyer in Philadelphia. The debt was paid. Your father's $3,000 was settled from my account on the 22nd of December, a week before you boarded the train. Clara did not speak. I want to explain why I did not tell you immediately, Ethan said, because I have been thinking about how to explain it for some time and I want to get it right. He looked at his coffee. If I had told you that morning at the station or that first evening, you would have felt an obligation. Not gratitude, which is a different thing, but obligation. The kind that sits on a person's chest and makes every decision they make afterward into a payment on a debt instead of a free choice. He looked up. I did not want you to stay because you felt you had to. I wanted you to stay if you chose to, or to leave if that was also your choice, without money being the thing that decided it. The kitchen was quiet. The fire spoke softly in the range. From outside came the ordinary sounds of the ranch settling into its morning. Clara sat with this for a long moment. She thought about the four-sentence letter in the key to her room and the separate sleeping arrangements stated plainly without negotiation. She thought about a man who had paid $3,000 for a stranger's freedom before that stranger had even arrived. You are the most complicated, simple man I have ever encountered, she said. The corner of his mouth shifted. Reed has said something similar. He is right, Clara said. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the window. She looked back at Ethan. I would have chosen to stay, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever else was true about my circumstances, that part was mine. He nodded once. He drank his coffee. And in the quiet between them, in the warmth of the kitchen, on a February morning, with the mountains outside and the ranch around them, and the sound of Lily beginning to wake upstairs, something that had been working toward resolution for 2 months arrived there. 2 days later, she found Cole at the barn. He was alone with a big horse named Soldier, working on a hoof that had been tender since the hard freeze. He was crouched beside the animal's foreleg with a hoof pick, and his hands were as careful as his face was not. He looked up when she came in, registered her presence without alarm, and returned to the work. She sat on the wooden crate near the center post and watched him work. The barn was warm from the animals and smelled of hay and leather and the particular earthen sweetness of working horses. After a while, she said, I read what Margaret wrote about you. I know, he said. He did not stop working. She wrote about you more than anyone else, Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. Margaret had a habit of seeing clearly and writing down what she saw. It was one of the things about her. She wanted you to be happy. Cole set down the pick and straightened and turned to look at her. His expression was not closed, not the way it had been in January, but it was not open in the way of easy people. It was the expression of someone who has been working on a problem for a long time and has not arrived at a solution, but has at least arrived at an honest statement of the problem. Margaret was the most generous person I have known, he said. She included me in everything she hoped for, even the things that were not mine to have. He looked at Soldier's flank without seeing it. I loved her. I never told her. I decided not to because it would have put a weight on her that she did not deserve to carry. She carried it anyway. He paused. I have spent 2 years being angry at myself about that. She did not want you to be angry at yourself, Clara said. I know, he said. That does not make it easier to stop. Clara looked at him. What she wrote about you, the last part of it. She said that when you finally love someone fully, that person will be the luckiest one on earth. She said it plainly, not as a gift, but as information, the way you deliver something that belongs to someone. She meant it. Cole did not look away. He held her eyes with the directness that was, she had come to understand the most important thing about him. Everything else he might withhold. The looking he gave you fully. She also wrote, Clara said, that she hoped whoever came after her would be braver than she was. I think she underestimated herself. Cole was quiet for a long time. The horse moved and settled. Outside, the wind came briefly and passed. Thank you, he said finally, for not pretending. He picked up the hoof pick and went back to Soldier's hoof. And Clara sat on the crate a while longer in the warm barn, And when she stood to go, she felt the difference in the air between them, the particular lightness that follows the setting down of something heavy that has been carried for too long. March came with the first suggestions of thaw water, moving under ice, the snow pulling back from south-facing slopes to reveal the brown of last year's grass beneath. The territorial court convened in Mercy Falls on a Tuesday in the single-room courthouse that served also as the county records office and occasionally as the emergency medical station when the nearest doctor was unavailable. Judge Morrison presided. He was 62 years old, deliberate in his movements and his speech, with the weathered patience of a man who had listened to a great many people's versions of events and had become very good at determining which portions were true. Victoria Marsh presented her case with her Denver lawyer beside her, a neat, prepared man who spoke in the vocabulary of territorial family law with the fluency of someone paid to know it. He argued the instability of the domestic arrangement, the absence of formal matrimonial sanction, the irregular presence of multiple adult men in a household containing a minor child, and Victoria's blood claim as the child's maternal aunt and closest surviving Marsh family relative. Ethan responded without a lawyer, which was a choice he had made deliberately, and which said something about either his confidence or his character or both. He spoke briefly. He stated that Lily was his daughter, that she had lived in his care her entire life, that she was healthy and educated and loved, and that the domestic situation at Callaway Ranch was in the process of being formalized. Then Judge Morrison did something the Denver lawyer had not prepared for. He asked that the adults wait in the main room. He asked that Lily be brought in to speak with him alone. Victoria's lawyer objected. Morrison listened to the objection with the attention of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is giving courtesy its due time. Then he thanked the lawyer for his input and asked again that Lily be brought in. Lily came from the side room where Reed had been sitting with her. She walked past Clara and paused and looked up, and Clara met her eyes and gave her the smallest nod. Not encouragement exactly, but acknowledgement. The look that says, "I see you and you are ready." Lily went in. The wait was 15 minutes. Clara stood near the window and watched the frozen street outside and did not speak. Cole stood beside the door with his arms at his sides, which for Cole was the equivalent of restlessness. Reed sat and read from a small notebook he had brought and managed to appear calm, which Clara suspected was an act performed for the benefit of the room. Ethan stood near the wall with his hat in both hands and did not move. Morrison opened the door and came back to the bench with the composed expression of a man who has received the information he needed. He opened the file, he read something from it, then he looked up at the room. "I have spoken at some length with Lily Callaway," he said. "She is a child of unusual clarity. I found her account of her domestic situation to be consistent, specific, and largely unprompted." He looked at Victoria Marsh. "The court finds no evidence of instability or harm. Quite the contrary. The child demonstrates emotional security and specific attachment to her father and to the other adults in her household that speaks well of the environment she has been raised in." He looked at Ethan. "Custody remains wholly and without condition with Ethan Callaway. The petition of Victoria Marsh is denied." Lily came out of the side room and walked straight to Clara and put both arms around her waist and held on, and then without releasing her hold, turned her face up and said loudly enough that the Denver lawyer heard it, "I told him I have two mamas. He said that was not wrong." On the courthouse steps, Harlan Voss was waiting. He had positioned himself at the bottom of the stairs, visible from the door, and when they came out, he raised his voice before anyone had descended 2 steps. The street was not empty. It was midday, and Mercy Falls had a small population, but that population ran on news the way a fire runs on dry wood, and a considerable number of people had found reasons to be on or near the main street that morning. Voss addressed Ethan. He spoke about the mineral rights document. He spoke about the territorial law covering unresolved debt obligations. He spoke about the right of any citizen to bring a valid legal claim before the appropriate courts. His voice was measured and loud and carried well in the cold air, and the people on the street listened with the attentive silence of people who are learning something they did not already know. Ethan did not respond. He stood at the top of the steps and looked at Voss with the expression he used for things that did not require comment, which was the same expression he used for broken fence posts and dead wood and other problems that simply needed to be addressed rather than discussed. Reed came down the stairs and stopped at the bottom 2 steps from Voss and reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He produced a sheaf of papers. He held them up not toward Voss but toward the street so that the people standing within 20 yards could see that they were official documents bearing stamps and seals of the kind that territorial offices use. The mineral rights certificate presented by Harlan Voss of Philadelphia, Reed said in the same clear, unhurried voice he used to explain things that he understood thoroughly and wanted others to understand equally well, bears the signature of William Whitfield as grantor. That signature is a forgery. He turned to address the street directly. I have here certified copies of 23 authenticated documents bearing William Whitfield's genuine signature obtained from the Philadelphia Municipal Records Office in the Pennsylvania Land Registry. The capital letter K in William Whitfield's genuine signature presents in a consistent and specific manner across all 23 of these documents. In the Voss certificate, it presents differently in a manner inconsistent with every authentic example. He set the first set of papers on the step beside him in a neat stack weighted with a stone against the wind. I also have a letter from the Notarial Commission of the Wyoming Territorial Office confirming that one of the witnesses named on this certificate died 14 months before the document's stated date. He set the second set of papers alongside the first. Anyone who wishes to examine these documents is welcome to do so, Reed said. Judge Morrison has already been informed of their full contents and has scheduled a hearing for the forgery matter for next Thursday. The street was quiet for a moment. Then Thomas Bradley, who ran the largest producing farm in the valley and who owed 3 good harvests partly to Callaway equipment, lent without charge during a breakdown 4 summers prior, stepped forward from the doorway of the feed merchant. I have known the Callaway family for 11 years, he said. He was not a man who made speeches. He said it simply as a fact and let it stand. A woman named June Wheeler, whose difficult confinement 2 winters ago had been managed by Clara when the nearest doctor was unreachable and who had not said publicly what she had intended to say privately for some time, stepped off the boardwalk. Others followed. Not all of them. Mrs. Peterson remained where she was by the dry goods window with her mouth in its familiar line. Not everyone who had whispered would now stand forward, but enough did one by one in the cold March air of Mercy Falls to make clear that the opinion of a town is not a single thing, but a collection of individual choices, and some of those choices were being made differently than they had been made in January. Harlan Voss looked at the people and at the documents on the step and at the expression on Reed's face, which was not triumphant, merely patient, the face of a man who has done the work and is now simply waiting for the facts to be acknowledged. He picked up his hat from where the wind had shifted it. He left. He left Mercy Falls that afternoon and did not return. And in the spring, the word came back from Denver that the matter of the forged mineral certificate had been resolved in the territorial court to the satisfaction of the Callaway family and to the considerable professional disadvantage of Harlan Voss. Before they left the courthouse, Cole detached himself from the group with a quiet word to Reed and crossed the street. Victoria Marsh was standing near her horse at the hitching post outside the hotel preparing to leave. She had not spoken to anyone since the judge's ruling. Her lawyer had already gone inside to collect his case from the hotel room. She stood alone in the cold with her hands on the reins and her face composed into the expression of someone who has decided to absorb a loss without commentary. Cole stopped beside her. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. He held it out. Victoria looked at it. Margaret left this for you, Cole said. I found it with the diary. Same place, same time. I did not read it. He paused. That is the truth. Victoria took the envelope from his hand. She looked at it for a moment at her own name and her sister's handwriting, the careful pen of a woman who had been dead for 2 years and had nonetheless apparently found a way to still have things to say. Cole did not wait. He turned and walked back across the street to where Ethan and the others stood watching. Clara watched Victoria from a distance. She could not hear anything. She could only see the woman open the envelope and unfold the pages inside and begin to read. She watched Victoria's face change the way faces change when they encounter something they have been waiting for without knowing. They were waiting a slow rearrangement, a loosening the particular expression of grief that comes not from new loss, but from old loss finally being allowed its full shape. Victoria read for a long time. The horse shifted. The wind moved through the street. When she finished, she folded the letter and held it in both hands for a moment pressed against the front of her coat. Then she raised her eyes and looked across the street. She looked at Ethan, at Reed, at Cole, at Clara, who was standing with Lily's hand in hers. And in that look was something Clara had not expected to find there. Not forgiveness, which had not been necessary. Not welcome, which had come too late to serve its purpose. Something quieter than both. Something like the setting down of an argument that had been worth having and was now finished. Victoria Marsh nodded once. She put her foot in the stirrup and mounted and rode south toward Denver. And Clara watched her go and thought about a woman who had written the end of her own story into the margin of someone else's beginning and had arranged for it to be delivered when it would do the most good. That evening, the four of them sat around the fire after Lily was in bed, and for a long time no one spoke. The silence was different from the silences of January. Those had been the silences of strangers in a shared space, each person maintaining the careful separateness of people who have not yet decided how much of themselves to risk. This silence was the silence of people who have been through something together and are sitting with the shape of what it was. Reed broke it. He was looking at the fire when he said, "Clara, whatever Ethan decides, Cole and I want you to know that this is your home, not because of any arrangement, because you are family." Cole looked at the floor. He nodded once. That was all. From Cole, that was everything. Clara looked at them both, then she looked at Ethan. He was watching her with the steady amber attention she had come to know as the most honest thing about him, the look that preceded the words he had been choosing for a while. He did not speak yet. They sat in the firelight, and outside the wind came and the mountains stood in the dark and the ranch held its quiet. The next morning, Lily set a trap. It was not a subtle trap. Lily Calloway had her father's directness without his patience for indirect methods, and she had been watching the two adults in her house circle each other for 3 months with the mounting exasperation of someone who knows the answer to a problem and cannot understand why no one is writing it down. She called them both into her room on the pretext of a spider that turned out upon inspection to not exist. Ethan stood in the doorway. Clara stood near the window. Lily stood in the middle of the room with her hands on her hips and looked from one to the other. "There is no spider," Ethan said. "I know," Lily said. "I needed you both in the same place." She looked at her father. "Papa, you look at Mama Clara the way you looked at Mama Margaret in the photograph. The one on the mantel." She turned to Clara. "And you know how he takes his coffee without asking. You knew from the first morning." She looked between them again with the clear impatience of a child confronting two people who have made something very simple into something very complicated. "You love each other. You are both scared because people in town say mean things. But people in town already say mean things, and you are still here. So I do not understand what you are waiting for. You are being very foolish, and I am tired of watching it." Ethan stared at his daughter. Clara pressed her lips together against a smile that was also something more serious than a smile. "Lily," Ethan said. "Papa," Lily said with considerable firmness, "I have been patient." Ethan looked at his daughter for then he looked at Clara, and something in his face had come loose from its usual and careful arrangement, something he had been keeping in position for a long time, and had apparently decided on the authority of his daughter's exasperation that it did not need to stay there. "Give us a minute," he said to Lily. Lily looked at him with narrowed eyes. "A short minute," she specified, and went out into the hall and pulled the door closed behind her with the decisive click of someone whose patience has specific limits. Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. "She is not wrong," he said. "No," Clara said. "She is not." He crossed the room and stood before her, and in the morning light from the window, she could see all of it, every year of the solitary winters in the ranch built by labor, and the daughter raised without a mother, and the grief carried quietly for so long it had become almost indistinguishable from his ordinary posture. She could see the weight of it, and she could see what it cost him to set it down. "I told you when you came that I needed patience and loyalty and someone willing to make a house into a home," he said. "I did not tell you the full truth of what I was asking because I did not know it yet myself." He was looking at her without reserve, which was different from the steady attention he used for ordinary things. "Somewhere between the first morning and last night, I stopped thinking about you as a solution. I started thinking about you as an everything way." He paused the way he always paused when he needed the words to be right. "I would rather be judged by every person in this valley for the rest of my life than spend another winter without you in it. I would rather be wrong about everything and right about this." He went to one knee, not because the gesture came naturally to a man of his kind in 1873, because he had been thinking about who she was and what she had done, and he had decided that the person who had held his daughter through a fever and delivered a calf in a snowstorm and walked into a dark timber in a blizzard and refused to go down without a fight deserved something that said more than words. "Marry me, Clara, not because they demand it, not because the paperwork requires it, because I cannot imagine being the man I intend to be without you beside me." From the hallway, very clearly through the closed door, came Lily's voice. "Say yes, Mama Clara. I can hear everything." Clara looked at the door. She looked down at Ethan, who was looking up at her with the undisguised earnestness of a man who has finished being careful and is now simply being true. "Yes," she said. And then, because of the hall and the door and the small person on the other side of both "yes to all of you," the door opened immediately. Lily came in at speed and inserted herself between them with the efficiency of a child who has been ready for this for some time. From downstairs, Reed's voice, "I heard that. Cole owes me $2. Cole's voice from further away in the kitchen, "I heard that too." That evening after supper, Ethan took a knife from his belt and stood in the front doorway with the lamp held up by Reed, and he carved 3 names into the doorframe cut deep into the old wood one beneath another. His own name first, Clara below it, Lily below that. He left space which he did not explain and did not need to explain, and when he finished, he ran his thumb across the letters and looked at them for a moment. "Making it permanent," he said. Clara stood behind him and looked at the 3 names in the lamplight and felt the full weight of the word. Permanent. Not a promise about a feeling which could change, but a promise about a choice which was different. Lily leaned around her father to examine the carving and announced that her name was spelled correctly, which she had been concerned about. They were married in May. The valley had come back from winter by then. The slopes green and moving with the early grass, the creek full and loud with snowmelt wildflowers spreading across the south-facing meadows in the particular extravagance of Montana springs that have been winter long enough to mean it. The ceremony was held in the meadow east of the house, under a sky that was the blue of something that had never been anything else. Pastor Williams had sent his regrets. No one had expected otherwise, and no one particularly minded. Judge Morrison, who had received his invitation from Lily in a letter that contained 3 spelling errors, 2 drawings of horses, and a request that he bring his dog. If he had one, came without the dog, but with the same composure he brought to his courtroom, and a warmth beneath it that Clara had suspected was there, and was pleased to find confirmed. Ethan wore the good suit that Cole had driven him to purchase in Helena 2 weeks prior over his protest because Cole had decided that a man getting married in the meadow behind his own house should not do it in his working clothes. The suit was dark and well cut, and Ethan wore it with the slight stiffness of a man in unfamiliar territory, and Reed had tied his cravat for him twice before Ethan held still long enough to let him do it correctly. Clara wore her mother's dress, Blue, the color of the sky in the hour before full dark, altered to fit her, the lace at the collar and cuffs cleaned and pressed. She had carried it from Philadelphia in the bottom of the trunk, and it had survived the journey in the same condition as the person who owned it, not untouched but not broken. Lily stood between her father and Clara with a bunch of wild flowers she had picked herself and her best dress on, and an expression of profound satisfaction, like a person who has solved a problem and is watching the solution take its final form. Cole and Reed stood behind Ethan. Cole was wearing his good shirt fully buttoned, which was not a daily occurrence. Reed was trying not to look as pleased as he was. A small gathering of people stood on the grass. Thomas Bradley and his family, June Wheeler, several other families who had stood on the courthouse steps in March. Not everyone who had ever spoken unkindly, but the ones who had made different choices when the moment required it. Morrison read the words with the gravity they deserved and without making them longer than they needed to be. Do you, Ethan Calloway, take Clara Ann Whitfield as your wife and partner in all things? I do, Ethan said. He looked at her when he said it. In all things, for all time. And do you, Clara Ann Whitfield, take this man as your husband and companion through whatever comes? I do, Clara said. Gladly, and forever. I also do, Lily said from directly between them with complete seriousness. Morrison looked down at the child for a moment. Then he said with the gravity of a man honoring what is true, the declaration of Lily Calloway is noted for the record. The small gathering laughed. Reed laughed longest. Cole smiled, which was rare and therefore worth more. Under the May sky with the mountains watching and the creek loud in its banks, and the meadow grass moving in a slow breeze, the Calloway family was complete. The years that followed were not perfect years. They were something better than perfect. They were real. The summer of 1873, Clara planted an apple orchard on the south slope of the home pasture. 15 trees chosen from a nursery catalog with the careful deliberation she brought to things she intended to last. 3 years later, the first fruit came small and tart and bright, and Ethan cut one open on the porch steps and handed half to Clara without ceremony. And she ate it and said it was good, and he said nothing, but the expression on his face was the one she had learned to read as the closest thing he had to celebration. In the fall of 1873, their first child was born, a boy solid and loud from the first moment who looked like Ethan from the beginning and like Clara by degrees as he grew. They named him William for her father, and this naming was Ethan's idea offered quietly one evening by the fire, and Clara had looked at him across the room and not been able to speak for a moment. The winter of 1878 was the worst they had known. A failure of the summer harvest, a disease in the cattle that took 11 animals a debt, that grew through the cold months into something that required sitting with on dark evenings. Clara sat with it. She and Ethan sat together at the kitchen table after Lily and William were in bed, going over the accounts by lamplight, and one night she said what she believed to be true because she had come to understand that in this marriage, truth was the most useful currency they had. We will get through this, she said. Harder things have been survived. He looked at her across the table. He recognized his own thinking in her words, the particular stubborn patience that he had always carried alone, and that she had, without announcing it, taken up as her own. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers and left it there. They got through it. Harder things had indeed been survived. In the summer of 1881, Cole married. Her name was Mabel Prescott. She was a widow from the settlement at Wolf Creek with 2 children of her own, and a directness of manner that meant she and Cole understood each other within the first conversation. The wedding was at Calloway Ranch under the apple trees, which were produced well by then, and when Mabel came out to take Cole's arm, Clara stood nearby, and Mabel looked at her with the eyes of a woman assessing the landscape of a life she was entering, and said, "He talks about you, not about Margaret, though I know that story, about you. He says you were the one who made him understand the house still had room for him." Clara had thought about this for a long time afterward, about houses and room, and the specific mercy of being seen by someone who has no reason to look. Cole was not a transformed man after Mabel. He was still Cole, still contained, still more likely to show you what he felt by doing something about it than by speaking of it. But the quality of his stillness changed. It became the stillness of a man at rest rather than a man in resistance. And this was a different thing entirely and worth everything the years had cost to arrive at. Reed left for Denver in 1884 to study agricultural science at the college there. He wrote long letters from the city that were everything you would expect from Reed, full of ideas and observations, and the occasional digression into questions that had nothing to do with the original subject, but were interesting on their own merits. He came back 3 years later with a degree and a wife named Blythe, who was from Illinois and who had the particular gift of finding Reed's enthusiasms genuinely interesting, which was the rarest and most useful quality she could have brought to the marriage. Reed and Blythe eventually settled on their own claim, 10 miles north, and he applied everything he had learned in Denver to the soil and seasons of Montana with the focused intelligence of a man who had always been most at home inside a problem worth solving. He and Clara continued to trade books until the end of her life, and the discussions continued at every family gathering across 40 years, and Lily's children grew up listening to these conversations and believed that disagreeing about books was a perfectly ordinary form of love, which it was. In the fall of 1889, Lily married. His name was Fletcher Bradley, Thomas Bradley's youngest son, and he had been Lily's particular adversary, and then her particular friend for most of their childhood, in the way that children who are very alike sometimes are adversaries first. He was steady and good-humored, and thought Lily was remarkable, which was the correct opinion. Ethan walked her out to the meadow where the ceremony was held, and came back to stand beside Clara afterward, with his hat in his hands, and the look on his face that she knew as the specific expression of a man trying very hard not to show that he was feeling a great many things at once. She took his hand. He held hers. They did not need words for it. By the winter of 1891, William had made his decision. He was 18, old enough to have considered the options, and what he said to his parents one evening by the kitchen fire was this: "Father built this with his hands. I want to keep it." He said it simply, without decoration, in the same voice Ethan used for true things. Clara looked at her son and saw her father's name in Ethan's hands and something that was entirely its own self, and she understood that the best thing a life can do is generate more life that is better and different and entirely genuine. In the spring of 1898, Ethan was sick for the first time in his adult life. Not gravely, but enough. A fever that took him off his feet for 2 weeks and required him to submit to being cared for, which was more difficult for him than the fever. Clara sat with him every morning. She brought 2 cups of coffee, and she read to him, not the practical books he kept for ranch management, but the ones from the shelf she had carried from Philadelphia and added to over the years. She read to him in the low voice she used for things that mattered, and he lay in the bed that had been their shared bed for 25 years and listened. And once on the 3rd morning, he said, "I did not know you were a reader when I agreed to this arrangement." The letter only had 4 sentences, Clara said. There was no room for everything. "What else was there no room for?" he said. She looked at him over the book. Considerable amounts. The corner of his mouth shifted. He closed his eyes and she read on, and outside the spring snow was melting off the roof and running in the gutters, and the apple trees on the south slope were beginning their annual astonishment. October 19th. 02, the valley below Mercy Falls held its autumn color, in the way Montana valleys do, everything orange and gold, and the particular red of the scrub maples on the lower slopes, the sky above it, the clean blue of something that has been washed by the first cold nights. The mountains had their first dusting of high snow white at the peaks and fading to bare rock below the signal that winter was considering its return. Callaway Ranch stood on its slope in the morning light, unchanged in its bones and expanded in every other way. The original house had grown to the south and east, rooms added as the years required them. The porch extended twice, the barn rebuilt after a lightning strike in 1885 and rebuilt better. The apple trees were old now, their trunks thick with years, and they bore fruit still with the reliability of things that had been well established and well tended. The fences ran straight and far in every direction, the evidence of work done consistently and without complaint across 30 years. The yard was loud this morning. Lily and Fletcher were there with their three children, the oldest 9, and already beginning to look like Lily, all directness and forward movement. Cole and Mabel and their two grown children had come over from the Wolf Creek place the night before and were staying the week. Reed and Blythe and their family had arrived on Friday. William and his wife moved through the yard with the ease of people who belong where they are, and their two children added their noise to the general happy commotion of a family that had been adding people for 30 years and had found each time that there was room. Ethan stood at the front door of the house, 65 years old, white-haired. Now the lines on his face deep and earned his posture as straight as it had been at the Mercy Falls station on a December afternoon in 1872. His hands were the same hands, calloused, capable, unhurried. He was watching the yard. Clara came out behind him with 2 cups of coffee. She was 52 and her hair had gone the color of the late afternoon light, and she wore it pinned up with the loose wisps at her temples that Ethan had been brushing aside with one finger for 29 years. She stood beside him and set one cup on the porch rail, where he always set his, and kept the other in both her hands. They watched the yard together, Reed trying to explain us something about soil drainage to Fletcher, who was not convinced. Cole and Mabel's eldest moving along the fence line with William, the two young men deep in a conversation about cattle that their respective fathers had prepared them for across decades. The children running. "Do you remember the letter?" Clara said. "Which letter?" Ethan said. "The 4 sentences." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking about it in the same way she had felt him think through things for 30 years, that particular quality of stillness that preceded the words he chose carefully. "I remember it," he said. "You wrote that you needed patience and loyalty and someone willing to make a house into a home." She looked out at the yard, at everything the years had built and accumulated and generated. "You received considerably more than you asked for." Ethan looked at the yard. He looked at it for a long time, at all the people in it who were there because of choices made across 3 decades. Small choices and large ones, choices made in blizzards and courtrooms and kitchen tables and barn floors. Choices made with full knowledge of what they cost and full conviction that they were worth it. He picked up his coffee. "I received everything," he said. Later that afternoon, and Clara sat on the porch with Lily's eldest, a girl of 8 named Margaret, which was Lily's particular and private way of honoring what had come before. The child had asked for a story, and Clara had been telling her about the train ride west, about the way the Missouri River had looked from the bridge, woodsy and serious and certain of its direction. The girl sat very still in the way of a child who was genuinely listening. "Grandma," she said when Clara paused, "were you scared when you came here, when you stepped off the train?" Clara looked out at the valley, at the mountains to the north with their first snow. She thought about a cold December platform in a leather bag and a letter with 4 sentences in it. She thought about a child who had run through the snow and taken her hand as if it was the most natural thing on earth. "Yes," she said, "very scared." "Then why did you stay?" the girl asked. Clara looked at the yard where Ethan had come down from the porch and was standing with Cole at the fence line. The two of them looking out at the horses in the lower pasture with the easy silence of men who have stood like this 1,000 times. Cole said something. Ethan looked at him sideways and said something back. Both of them stood looking at the horses. She looked at the apple trees, heavy and old in the October light. She looked at the names carved into the doorframe behind her, 3 of them, and then more added over the years, each one cut deep enough to last. "Because winter always ends," she said, "and I had found the people worth staying for." The girl considered this with the seriousness of someone who understands they are receiving something important. "And the fox," she said, "the one Lily followed into the snow, was it real?" Clara smiled. "I believe Lily would say yes." "What would you say?" "I would say," Clara said, "that whether it was real or not, it brought us all together. And that is worth more than whatever was actually in the trees. The child nodded, satisfied. She leaned against Clara's side in the way that children lean against the people they trust, absolutely putting their whole weight into it, without question. The October sun moved in the valley. The mountains held their snow. The ranch stood on its slope the way it had always stood, solid and unhurried. The names in the doorframe, weathered now but legible, cut deep enough into the old wood that 30 winters had not touched them. Inside, supper was beginning. Clara could hear Reed's voice and then Mabel's laughter and Lily directing traffic in the kitchen with the authority of someone who had grown up knowing that kitchens were where the important things happen. She could hear the children. She could hear William calling something to his father across the yard, and Ethan's answer brief and certain, the voice that had said everything she needed to hear in fewer words than most people needed for ordinary things. Clara sat on the porch with Margaret leaning against her side and listened to her family filling the house with sound and life and all the ordinary sacred noise of people who have made a life together. And are this October evening tipping it, she had stepped off a train into the coldest air she had ever breathed 30 years ago, with one bag and a letter and a fear she had refused to let be the last word. She stayed. That was always the whole of it. The rest was everything that grew from that single stubborn choice, root by root and year by year, too deep now for any wind to touch. She stayed.